Hey, new year, new reading. Welcome. My name is Melody. If you haven't been here before, I talk about books and book adjacent things. If you have been here before, so happy to have you back. And if you have been here before, you may remember that 2024 was a little bit of a roller coaster for me in terms of reading. I had a great start to the year, especially through March, and then I struggled a little bit. Granted, I had a lot going on and I've given myself a lot of grace in terms of, life taking precedence. However, it was really frustrating for me as a reader because there are so many books I'm excited about at any given moment and I wanted to be reading them. And so this month I feel like I've had a little bit of a return to form. I don't know that I'll feel fully safe in my reading year until I get through and after March. And I have a family wedding at the beginning of May that will start to steal some of my attention as well, deservedly. But for January, I feel like I had a pretty good start with 12 books, and I would love for us to be able to talk about them a little bit more right now. Starting with The Wedding Witch by Erin Sterling. And this is the third in the Graves Glen series that started with The X-Hex and The Kiss Curse. And this is following Reclusive Brother Bowen. Now, I also read this for my romance book club. For December, we decided for our holiday gathering, we would read a holiday or winter romance and report back via a PowerPoint night. Now, we, by twists of fate and adulthood and scheduling, actually just had that night last night because we had to reschedule. And I woefully, in terms of my time management and prioritization, did not actually make my PowerPoint. However, I did make a Stefan list, and considering I went last, that is about what our attention spans could handle at that moment anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the more PG gist of this Stefan list, because some things are book club exclusives, and this is just a personal book club, not like a paywalled book club. This is just me and my friends having some giggles and reading romance, which is my favorite thing. Anyway, this book, The Wedding Witch, has everything. Obnoxious novelty Christmas cocktails with curly straws, reclusive Welsh lumberjack man that isn't a werewolf for some reason, witches, email flirting, searches for magical artifacts, gothic castles, a heist gone awry, ghosts and those ghosts adjacent, time travel, only one bed, baths, use your imagination, and, of course, a wedding. And, of course, for those who have been with the rest of the series, we do get returns of some of our favorite characters and a lot of that family banter that's really fun, especially with a more taciturn hero and a heroine that is pulling him out of his shell. I will admit that this book took some turns in terms of the direction of this book at all that I wasn't anticipating. And also at 279 pages, it was noticeably shorter than the others, and a lot happens, but it's much quicker. And I don't know if this is because this is the direction Sterling was taking, if she wrote herself into a corner a little bit, or simply if because this was fitting more into the kind of holiday romance sphere, which I feel as a reader are a little punchier and faster paced. For instance, most of my friends last night read novellas, including, of course, two Tessa Dares, and historically we have enjoyed reading compilations, like Christmas compilations for the winter season. And so I really enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun, and at the same time it was very fast-paced, sometimes to the detriment of some of the kind of romantic beats and not getting to linger in them as much. However, because Sterling, aka Rachel Hawkins, has a history in young adult fiction, I feel like it suffered a lot less because she knows how to move through this plotting with banter and keep those stakes up in terms of a more constrained kind of time frame or page count. However we want to think about it, she knows how to utilize that space to the utmost in a lot of ways because of that background, and I think that that translates here for adult audiences with a lot of peppering of things that romance readers like myself really love in terms of some of the tropes this hits, as well as getting some surprising email flirting. Though don't worry, that's kind of a passage of time device in the beginning, and to let us see that these two characters have established a relationship over that time more than like a 50 Shades of Grey scenario where the emails kind of take over the narrative. And in this one, Bowen, our brother, who has been reclusive over the previous two books, we find out he is looking for these kind of magical artifacts in an effort to save his college roommate who attempted some darker magic and basically became a shadow of himself. And so he, Bowen, has been really eaten up by this guilt, and he ends up hiring our heroine, Tamsin, who we have met before, to track down some of these artifacts for him, and he has hired her exclusively. And where things start to go a little awry is when she takes a job outside of his employment that she thinks he won't notice, but he happens to show up at the same wedding at the behest of his ghost best friend because it is his ghost best friend's former fiancé that is getting married, and they soon realize that things are not as they seem at said wedding. So do with that as you will, but it has the typical Sterling kind of banter and charm that I feel has translated really well from her young adult work. Okay, next we have what may be my favorite book of the month. It's hard to pick favorites, but this is probably my favorite. It's my favorite according to my reading spreadsheet that I bought, where I had to pick a favorite of the month, and that is The Improvisers by Nicole Glover, which we did talk about in a Feature Friday. And this is a book set in the same world as The Undertakers and The Conductors, a duology that I love very dearly for its murder mystery and magic and romance all kind of combined within a historical setting. And this does the same, but now we're in the 30s. And as I mentioned before, I was kind of bereft realizing that we weren't going to get any more Hetty and Benji in the world of The Conductors and The Undertakers, because Hetty and Benji's romance is so special and I love it so much. I remember being so excited for that first book because it was billed as this mystery, this magical mystery series, but it was with an established couple. And I was interested in how that was going to play into the dynamic, because mysteries that I tend to gravitate toward, especially within the historical realm, involve couples kind of coming together, like in the Veronica Speedwell series, which I am woefully behind on. However, the marriage at the beginning of that series is more of a kind of marriage of convenience and circumstance. And so we get to watch that relationship that has all of this history already deepen over the course of that series, and I just love it. And I was sad that we weren't going to get any more books with them. And so I got actually emotional when I opened this book and saw the family tree, Hetty and Benji's family tree, and realized not only are we in the same world in terms of like the magic system, but we are following one of their grandchildren, Velma, in this book. And not only are we following one of their grandchildren, but we are also introduced to a new kind of romantic dynamic with Velma and a news reporter, Dylan, who also have a history of sorts at the start of the book and are thrown together over the course of this mystery. And so it went from me being really sad that we weren't going to get more of this couple that I loved so much to being really delightfully surprised by how much I loved Velma and Dylan, who had a similar kind of spark to them, but a different relationship dynamic as well, in that they were kind of rivals at the start of the book, but clearly drawn to each other, especially like Dylan would continuously kind of pop up where Velma was. However, while I deeply love the romantic elements of these books, it's not just romance, and the mystery is really central to the course of the book. And because we are in the 30s, and more importantly, because Velma is a pilot in this book, it opens up a wider world for us to explore, because Velma can literally fly places. So we have more territory we can chart in terms of the course of the mystery, and we do fly across the country from coast to coast, basically, in this book. Additionally, we do get to visit Hetty and Benji, or Velma visits Hetty and Benji as she is investigating this mystery that brings her closer to home than she anticipates. And I think it's a testament to how Glover built this world for this specific book as well, that as much as I was delighted to see Hetty and Benji again and would have loved to stay with them. At the same time, I did feel the wider world of this book kind of pulling me away from them with Velma, and was kind of itching to continue the story and get out of this household. And maybe that's just because Dylan wasn't there, I don't know. But Velma stood on her own enough that I didn't feel their loss as acutely. I will say I do think that this can be read as a standalone, absolutely. However, I do think you benefit a little bit from knowing the magic systems a little bit more from the original books, the kind of constellation magic, the kind of segregation of magic, and there is a lot to be said for that. But at the same time, I think you will pick it up pretty easily as well, because the magic is kind of incidental and it's utilized really well as a way to explore these different time periods. But I also did really enjoy watching where Glover paralleled the history with magic. For instance, the most prominent, I think, example of this in this book is the exploration of prohibition through the lens, particularly of magic and potions. So yeah, had a great time with this one. If you want some more in-depth thoughts, go ahead and check out that Feature Friday. And then because I was still on a Wicked kick and I realized I had purchased this audiobook at some point, I listened to I'm No Philosopher, But I Got Thoughts, Mini Meditations for Saints, Sinners, and the Rest of Us by Kristen Chenoweth. And this is a very short, kind of pithy book. It definitely is some thoughts. I enjoyed getting more insight into Chenoweth and some of her philosophy as an actor and as an artist. I really enjoyed hearing her talk particularly about the craft and getting kind of a clear timeline in some of her own artistic pursuits. I will say there is a lot of conversation about God and faith in here, so if that isn't particularly your jam, this may grate a little, even if I do personally really respect and appreciate Chenoweth's interpretation and also understand that her faith is a huge part of her and her philosophy and how she approaches the world, and so I absolutely get that. There was one bit that kind of chafed a little bit for me, and this is only because of my own history within theater and getting a theater degree, but she kind of echoes this advice that I personally heard a lot as an undergrad. This, if you can do anything else and enjoy it, do that. And I think the way that she presented it and also explored and kind of extrapolated from that healed some things in me in relation to it a little bit. I heard it a lot as an undergrad, and I'm not begrudging it because I don't think it was coming from an ill-intentioned place, but I do think that there needs to be some consideration of how a room full of 18 to 22-ish-year-olds are going to interpret that, kind of starting out on their journey. And it feels kind of like a challenge because it sets up the very realistic obstacles you're going to face as an artist in the real world. It really is true, right? That there is a lot of struggle involved, which we can have many, many conversations about who can afford to take on that struggle and not. But as I've said before, I think there's also something to be said about a group of young adults kind of taking that on as a challenge. And I knew that there was a certain amount in my own kind of consideration of it at the time of, I am tough enough for this, even if I probably wasn't at certain points. But I can do this. I am ready to suffer for the art in whatever way. And I feel like setting up to a bunch of young people this expectation that they're going to suffer for the art also kind of leaves the door open for a lot of the exploitation of artists that we see, especially from early career artists. And this idea that if you love something this much, you'll do it for free or you'll work up and whatever. And while I understand that budgets are limited and the artistic space is very fraught, especially right now, I understand all of this, right? But I do think that there are some conversations we need to be having with ourselves within certain artistic spaces. And I've seen this advice echoed in other books for other artistic disciplines. But yeah, if we're setting up young people for this expectation that there's going to be struggle and sacrifice, you are making it easier for institutions that are making money to exploit that struggle and sacrifice because it is just a matter of fact. And I do not think that that is how Chenoweth is framing this here. And some of my favorite bits of this book were her talking about her mentorship of young artists and the initiative she's spearheaded for young artists. And so again, I did really enjoy the follow-up to her stating that, but that definitely sticks out in my mind because that statement has a lot of baggage for me personally, and I've thought about it a lot over the years. Okay, next is a book where I seemingly have an unpopular opinion in a way that really makes me question my understanding of reality. And I don't begrudge people who like different things by any means. So this isn't personal attack for anyone that liked this book. Do not get me wrong. But I also don't understand how it has such a high rating, and that is Keep Me by Sarah Kate, which I listened to on audio. Now, I have not read Sarah Kate before. I did go into this knowing that it was going to be a little darker, but also that it was a modern kind of marriage of convenience setup, and I was very intrigued by that. And I've read darker romances, so it's not necessarily about that. However, this book felt so thin on the ground all the way around. It is a marriage of convenience. All of the darkness really involves the hero, I'm putting that in extreme quotations, verbally abusing our heroine. Also, while this is a marriage of convenience, the first meeting of Sylvie and Killian is kind of banana pants in that Sylvie is with her boyfriend at the time and is basically breaking into Killian's home to look at or for this artifact that is related to her boyfriend's family. And she's very cavalier about the whole thing, and she reads very immature at the start of the book and for most of the book. And I had a really hard time rooting for either of these people in anything, which is saying something because Killian was obviously the worst. And here's the deal. A lot of page space is played to his kind of like hedonistic parties in this house, which were really lackluster and very much a letdown in terms of the hedonism aspect. In reality, like the big kind of crux of it was that he was having an affair with one of his friend's wives. So I feel like a lot of this was being played out for this kind of verbal abuse was supposed to be charged and sexy in the switch up of it, but because it was done so poorly in terms of its characterization and the kind of build of these characters, it didn't succeed because it was just trying to hit, I feel like, these notes that people want in books without doing the emotional work for these characters to make that land. So we get that they are sparring and they're verbally kind of going at each other, but there's no real tension there or no real stakes. So it just feels mean and abusive. And then we get the tortured backstory for Killian that explains why he acts this way, but it doesn't engage with it in a real way, nor does he have a real reversal or sit with any of these emotions in a way that makes them land. I love a kind of reformed situation, right? I've read some dark things or some heroes that I didn't know if they could be redeemed. But he, for me, definitely was not. Just simply having a backstory does not automatically give you a pass without doing the work on page to make up for that or to realize what is feeding into what. Instead, Sylvie is like, oh, he has a tortured backstory. That explains everything. That's okay. And he does not grovel like at all. And also her own backstory for some of the ways she behaves also feels really thin in a way where it's written where it's supposed to hit certain beats for us as a reader, especially in terms of her parents, where we're supposed to be like, yeah, they got told off, and it's supposed to feel so satisfying, but it rings so empty because this entire book rings or rang for me so emotionally empty. And clearly I am in the minority thinking that, but friends, a love interest calling their love interest cow as the least offensive word that could be used is not in and of itself tension. Anyway, we can go to those places in romance, but I think that they deserve more care for the characters and the readers, and this just didn't land for me at all. Okay, moving on, I read The Decagon House Murders by Yukito Ayatsuji, which is a translated Japanese mystery a la like Agatha Christie, though I'm gonna be honest with you, I have not read any Agatha Christie. And so this involves a bunch of students who are in a mystery club and have adopted pseudonyms of famous characters within mystery fiction. And they are going to this remote island where there is kind of an unsolved mystery that has happened where they have a connection within their group that can get them on this island. And then the students start dying one by one. And then meanwhile, back on the mainland, we are following a couple former members of this group that are being pulled into this mystery via a note that they have been given. And it definitely is one of those mysteries that's focused on the puzzle of it all, which isn't where I personally go first in terms of my mysteries. I like my mysteries to be more character driven. That being said, I still had a fun time with this. I enjoyed the characterization as it was drawn and the kind of verbal sparring and the suspicions that escalated over the course of these students one by one meeting a fate of some kind. I will say the reveal itself, I don't know how I feel about it, but I think that if you like kind of puzzle fiction, puzzle mysteries, I think that this would definitely be something you would be into. And if you've read this, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, and then I reread King Lear by Shakespeare in preparation to read Julia Armfield's Private Rites, which we'll talk about in a second. This was my second time reading Lear, and this is one of the most popular Shakespeare tragedies that I have not studied in any capacity, whether in high school or in college. It was very interesting looking back on when I'd read it according to my Goodreads in 2009, but not really having any context of why I picked it up. My best guess is that it was in a compilation of 3 of Shakespeare's tragedies that I bought at the book fair that included Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth as well. And we read Macbeth my senior year, and so it would have been the only unread tragedy within that book that I felt I needed to read on my own. Did I understand it to any real depth? Probably not, but I remembered the gist of what we probably really culturally know about Lear, with the 3 daughters and the youngest not kind of giving in to the flattery of her father in order to gain her inheritance of 1/3 of the kingdom, which honestly was all I really needed for Private Rites, even if revisiting the drama of Edgar and Edmund was entertaining because I had completely forgotten about them. I'm not gonna lie. However, it was interesting too because I was running all over Chicago looking for this damn copy because I really wanted a folder. I prefer to read my Shakespeare like this because it's easier for me to kind of follow and notate as needed. And so after exhausting a couple of indies that didn't have it in stock because apparently the local schools are not reading King Lear this year, I ended up going to Barnes & Noble. And as I was checking out, the cashier was, making conversation, and he was like, "Oh, is this your first time reading Lear?" And I was like, "Oh no, I'm revisiting it because I'm reading Private Rites." And I was calling myself a nerd on the inside already, don't worry. But he was like, "Oh yeah." And he started talking about how this was one of Shakespeare's like bloodiest or cruelest tragedies. I forget the exact word he used, which was probably important. And I remember in the moment being like, did I misremember King Lear? And I think I kind of like jokingly said like, "Oh yeah, but it's no Titus." And with Shakespeare, we expect in a tragedy for there to be a pile of bodies at the end, right? And we get that here. But I don't think it was as devastating as I went in kind of recontextualizing or trying to see where that observation came from. Like, sure, we do have someone whose eyes are gouged out. That's pretty gruesome. Maybe gruesome was the word he was using. But I would argue that Macbeth has more tragic moments. I think my main takeaway from this reread was that Cordelia didn't get as much of her day in the sun and her kind of like moment of vindication as I had clearly misremembered that she did, but it was great to revisit that, and I have some other Shakespearean plays I need to either revisit or read for the first time upcoming in order to read some books that are rooted in said play. Okay, moving on. My voice is struggling today. It was probably all of the yelling at Romance Book Club last night, but then I read, unsurprisingly, Private Rites by Julia Armfield, author of Our Wives Under the Sea. This is a queer retelling of King Lear within a climate dystopia, and so there's a lot of focus on the constant rain, which makes sense within the context of Lear, and I loved some of those parallels. Again, it really is more the kind of exploration of these 3 sisters at the heart of this and this legacy of their father. The father is dead at the start of the book, so that is a main difference, but I liked seeing the parallels. So even though I don't think I needed to technically reread Lear going into this, there were some things that I picked up on that I might not have if I hadn't reread Lear. However, I think this stands very firmly on its own, and it was interesting to see this kind of reoccurring theme of water being involved in this kind of emotional horror. Like, these are very internal books still. I think that Armfield is very much still interested in dealing and exploring with the idea of loneliness and human connection here, and taking that to the extreme of a not so distant world where we are plagued by climate crisis, which is hard for me to read about, I'm not gonna lie. Like, I'm not ignoring that reality, but I also don't want to escape into that reality, if that makes sense. Still, Armfield's language here continues to be really lush and gorgeous. Some of the pacing, I don't know how we paced it, like kind of setting things up and then how it resolves, but if you want a kind of deeper analysis of some of that, I will let you go back and watch that Feature Friday rather than kind of going into all of that again, because we still have more books to talk about. Next we have Accidentally His by Sabrina Jeffries, which is one of the books I did manage to finish in my failed 24-hour reading challenge. And this is a romance that involves espionage and maybe kicking me back into my espionage era in terms of historical romance, because I absolutely adored this. I was like, why haven't I been reading more Sabrina Jeffries? I've enjoyed her historically. Why have I not been picking her up more regularly? And historically, there wasn't even a historical romance trope, but this involves Rafe, who is a spy for the British government, and he has suspicions that within a particular family there is a leak or a spy for the government that not only is compromising the safety of his fellow soldiers, but has already led to a major injury that has wounded pretty permanently his uncle, who was his guardian and from whom Rafe will inherit a title. And so he starts fake courting essentially Verity, but he starts to develop real feelings, of course. Of course. But where it's even more fun is that Verity has her eye on him from the beginning, and she's like, I've seen this guy before. And she has like named this unknown quantity, who is Rafe, something in her own head, kind of Scarlet Pimpernel-esque, in terms of like a masked vigilante who keeps showing up at things. But he's not a vigilante, he's just in disguise. But she sees through the disguise. And so she is kind of distrustful of him from the start, which is a really fun spiral for him when he realizes this, because he really starts to question all of his abilities as a spy, as he should, honestly. But this was a lot of fun. Before we move on completely, I'm just gonna flash this copy of The Improvisers that I forgot I had on hand. Next, we are going to talk about the second book I read during my failed 24-hour reading challenge, The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore. So we have talked about this already pretty in-depth there, but this is set in revolutionary France and is following a historical figure, the Glutton of Lyon, and kind of his history as we get to the moment where he shows up dying, having consumed a golden fork, and his kind of legacy, and not legacy, but maybe like legend, or just some of the heinous actions he has been accused of at the beginning of this book, that as a reader, we don't know if they're true or if they are just born of this kind of larger than life telling. And so that is part of what we explore over the course of the book. Now, as I said in that video, but is really important, I think, to reiterate, if you have a weak stomach, I would not read this one, because it obviously deals and talks about consuming a food quite a lot, but also is very descriptive in like the kinds of food and not food that he is consuming. And so that can be hard. I did appreciate the kind of structure of this book. I liked the kind of moving in and out of time. I feel like it lost some of its form a little bit in the last third, but I really liked how it started out, especially with this character kind of telling his life story to this nun who was set to watch him because he had to be under watch at all times. I was really intrigued with the kind of use of hunger as this kind of metaphor, especially within the context of this being set amidst revolutionary France, which is just the historical record, but the historical record that sets up some really nice metaphor. But I was also interested in the kind of onset of his hunger, which has a very distinct starting point in the book that, based on the few like brief kind of offhand articles I kind of read before bed, amidst this, isn't as distinct within the historical record where this came from. So there's some artistic liberty there, right, in the kind of start of it. And so that is a choice that means something within the context of the book. And I found that interesting. I don't know that I fully unpacked what we wanted to say there. One thing I did appreciate was, while revolutionary fervor was kind of around our character, it wasn't necessarily the center of things, in the sense that we saw a kind of man being buffeted about by the forces of fate, and this idea that even within the context of something that looms so large and the violence of the French Revolution that was widespread, this idea that people could still be going about their day-to-day tasks. They could be finding opportunistic opportunities, that's defining a word with a word, within the context of this. And so it was interesting to kind of think about that as a backdrop rather than the full momentum, if that makes sense. And I found that interesting in conversation, especially when we're dealing with something like hunger, and again, the metaphor and symbolism of that, and how that is a clear stand-in for a lot of the tensions of the time, and this idea that so many in France at the time were hungry. I think that there's a lot to be said there. Meanwhile, the kind of context of the book was very readable and fast-paced. I think the book was just around 300 pages. And again, I do think the end petered off a little bit in terms of some of that impact, but I do think it was a very interesting, if grotesque, read. Next, we have the first 2025 release I read, The Starlight Heir by Amelie Howard. It sounds like I'm saying error when I say heir within the context of this book. And this is a new romantasy. I do have an entire Feature Friday on it as well. It is interesting within the romantasy landscape because it seems to be taking more of a page out of fantasy romance, which is different than romantasy in terms of we are following this one couple from beginning to end within the context of this book, for better and worse sometimes, because it does feel kind of rushed at certain times. We are in the first person point of view of Soraya, who has been invited to the capital as one of the potential brides of the crown prince, where she in turn meets his bastard brother and also finds out that this gathering of potential brides may actually be more of a hunt for someone with particular powers that she starts to realize maybe she has, and goes on a quest from there. It moves very quickly, and I talk about that within the context. However, I do appreciate, again, that we get the entire arc of this couple within one book. I just feel like it all feels kind of rushed because of that. One thing I didn't talk about too much in that Feature Friday, I talked a lot about the point of view and the limitations of this singular first person point of view, which I stand by. And I talk about how that and some of the pacing can make it feel kind of young adult in nature, with the spice just kind of shoved in. Which is both graphic and feels apt. But another thing that's kind of adding to that, especially within the beginning of the book, when we are really kind of establishing this world and Soraya is talking to her best friend, there is some banter that reads very modern in its vernacular and the way it goes. And I think that that can be a little jarring as a reader within this fantastical realm. And that could really work for some readers. And who's not to say that this magical, fantastical world doesn't speak that way, I guess. But I will admit it took me out of the world a couple times. So yeah, but I talked about it a lot more in depth in that Feature Friday. Speaking of Feature Fridays, the last book I read this month that we did talk about in a Feature Friday was Where the Dead Brides Gather by Nuzo Ono, and this involves a young girl. She's 11. She starts at 10, turns 11 over the course of the book, and she becomes a bride sentinel in 1970s Nigeria. So Bata, our young girl, has been suffering from nightmares her whole life, and nightmares that kind of disturb the rest of her household. And on the eve of her cousin's wedding, she is possessed by the spirit of a dead bride, and she protects her cousin from another dead bride that means her harm, making her the bride sentinel. But this weakens her a little bit and opens her up to other spirits that then leads to her going to the kind of in-between liminal space of the dead brides and learning more about the dead brides and the powers and all of the mythology behind this, and then going home and being changed in a way that makes her family nervous. Like before, when she first became the bride sentinel, there was some kind of power and prestige associated with that for sure gained her father's attention, as everyone in the community was kind of asking her to promise to protect their future brides. But then when she comes back and she is kind of changed, she is hidden away by her family and just wants to kind of reclaim her former life. She does not want to be this bride sentinel. And then some drama and discord within her own household starts to come into play, and she is forced into the middle of it. So I definitely was surprised by this book in the sense that I went in expecting a lot of it to really be centered around the realm of the dead brides, and it really wasn't. And on top of that, the realm of the dead brides was actually my least favorite parts of the book because it felt kind of very blunt and surface level in its exploration. And so while everything came together in a really satisfying way, the shape of it kind of took me by surprise. But again, we have a more in-depth discussion of that in a Feature Friday if you are interested. And then finally, I listened to Always Remember Ben's Story by Mary Balogh, and this is the third in the Ravenswood series, and I will admit I have not read the previous two, though parts of the series have potentially appeared sporadically in anticipated release videos over the last few years. But this is following Ben Ellis, who is a widower and a bastard of the family who is at the center of the series, though he has been raised with all of the other children and as a child of the family, though they emphasize he is not legitimate quite a lot considering. And Lady Jennifer Arden, who is the daughter of a duke, I believe it's a duke, but there is a kind of social stratification there in terms of her rank versus his. But what brings these two together is a party at Ben's family home. The first time this party has been thrown in many, many years, which is a big deal according to the narrative. And Ben and Jennifer form an attachment over the fact that he is able to kind of see and anticipate some of her needs in relation to her disability because she was sick as a child or many years ago, and it's left her unable to walk. Particularly one leg is very weak. And so he sees her one morning kind of walking as she can with her crutches out in the garden and tries to help her regain some sense of mobility or allow her some opportunities and experiences that her family has kind of shielded her from and just assumed that she wouldn't be interested in because of her disability. And I will say, while I cannot speak on disability representation with any authority by any means, some of the way it was explored here I didn't love because it felt like Jennifer was supposed to kind of grin and bear it a lot of the time, a lot of how people treated her in relation to her disability, and she wasn't allowed to want, even if that's kind of like what her relationship with Ben was kind of exploring. But it felt like even within the bounds of the narrative itself, she was supposed to be good-natured about everything. And I was a little surprised by that because I remember reading a Balogh years ago, though I have not read her as regularly as other romance authors by any means, but I read the Survivors Club series that, to my recollection, dealt with similar themes with much more grace and nuance, though granted it's been 10 years, so I can't speak to that with any sense of authority, but that just felt really flat to me in this book, and honestly everything felt really flat to me in this book. I am so excited to never hear about this gosh dang fate ever again, because it was all about this party and nothing really happened, and then we kept hearing about more people coming to the party and who they were, and we kept shifting to different points of view, including Ben's precocious child. And then at one point, the precocious child decided that at least over the course of the house party, she would call Jennifer Mama, which just felt a little too heavy-handed for me, especially considering nothing was really happening. And I think that there were a lot of really interesting explorations set up here and tensions at play, especially in relation to this kind of perceived class difference between Ben and Jennifer, both between them, because that's the main obstacle in their relationship for both them and their families. And I would have liked to see that play out with more tension. I would have liked to see the relationship between Ben and Jennifer play out with more tension, because I'm sorry if this is your thing, but lines like, they seem to be attracted to one another, sexually attracted, that is, just don't do it for me, surprisingly enough. So this was written in a tone to me that felt like it wanted to be closed door, but then it would throw in some bits that felt more open door in a way that felt like they didn't fit. And the tension and the stakes didn't really match any way around for me. It ultimately felt really toothless. And I think that there is an opportunity, or there was an opportunity, like I said, to really grapple with some of these pieces that had been set up, especially in terms of Ben and Jennifer's situations and their statuses and what they felt were obstacles to their relationship. But it ended up to me feeling kind of quaint, but not in a charming way, in a way that was kind of frustrating for me. And I think part of it was just like this mismatch of tone and the plot not seeming to go anywhere and not really feeling that romantic drive or tension for these characters in a real tangible way. But again, that is just my reading experience, and those things may be more up your alley without any judgment. You may be in the mood for something that's a little slower paced and a little cozier in whatever sense. Though again, I do still think there are those moments where the tone just kind of mismatches out of nowhere, but that is just me. Personally, like I said, I'm just glad that I don't have to hear about that fate ever again. And with that, while that feels like a kind of lackluster wrap up to the month, that is indeed what I read this month. I don't generally talk about ratings specifically on this channel. The average I had for the month, according to my reading spreadsheet, was about a 3.1, which doesn't sound great, I recognize, but I still feel pretty great about this reading month. But I also think that you could probably surmise, based on this conversation, some of the things that were pulling that down a little bit. So with that being said, I would love to hear about your reading month, how your reading year started off, what you loved, what maybe you didn't, and what of the books I've read you've read, and what you thought about them. But as always, I really appreciate you hanging out and being interested in what I have to say about books. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.